In a folder marked Cott County 1974, held in the Archives of Appalachia at East Tennessee State University, there is a photograph of a pine floorboard pried loose from a cabin in the Tennessee hills. Beneath it, a copper coil, a leather pouch, and a child's school primer, 3 objects, 1 hiding place. A century of survival. That cabin belonged to a family that outwitted federal agents for more than 40 years. They were not unusual. From the Blue Ridge of Virginia down through the Smokies into northern Georgia, thousands of mountain families lived 2 lives at once: the life above the floorboards where the law could see them, and the life beneath where they kept the things that kept them alive. What should not have worked is this: a scattered, illiterate, dirt-poor population with no money, no lawyers, and no political power held off the most aggressive federal enforcement campaign in American rural history. They did it with hand tools, family memory, and what they hid under their own feet. The historian Joseph Earl Dabney, in his 1974 book Mountain Spirits, documented how the floorboard itself became the single most important piece of furniture in an Appalachian home. Not the table, not the bed, the board you stepped on every morning without thinking. To understand why, you have to understand the world before the trouble started. In the years after the Civil War, the Appalachian Highlands were a region the rest of America had effectively abandoned. Horace Kephart, the librarian who left Street, Louis, in 1904 and walked into the Smokies with a notebook, described in our Southern Highlanders a country where a man might travel 3 days on foot without seeing a road wide enough for a wagon. The soil was thin. The growing season was short. Corn was the one crop that grew reliably on a steep hillside, and corn in its raw form could not be carried to market. A mule could pack 4 bushels of corn down a mountain trail. That same mule could pack the distilled equivalent of 24 bushels in liquid form. The math was not a moral question. It was arithmetic. For nearly 100 years, that arithmetic was legal or close enough to it. Families distilled openly. They paid the small federal tax when they could, ignored it when they couldn't, and the revenue men rarely climbed that high. Children grew up watching their grandfathers tend to copper still the way other children watch their grandfathers tend to garden. The knowledge passed without ceremony. A boy of 9 could tell you the difference between the foreshot, the heads, the hearts, and the tails. He learned it the way he learned his letters, often before, but the world above the mountains was changing. The temperance movement gathered force through the 1890s and into the new century. State after state went dry. And in January of 1920, the 18th Amendment turned every cabin in the Appalachian Highlands into a potential federal crime scene. This is where the floorboards begin to matter. The Internal Revenue Service, in its Prohibition-era enforcement reports, documented a sharp escalation of raids into the southern mountains beginning in 1922. Agents traveled in teams of 4 and 6, often guided by paid informants, often armed with axes meant to destroy stills on sight. Between 1,922 and 1,935, federal agents and local moonshiners exchanged gunfire on hundreds of occasions. The exact number of mountain men killed in those encounters has never been fully tallied. District court records from the Western District of Virginia alone list more than 200 fatal or near-fatal raids in that period. The families responded the way mountain people had always responded. They went underneath. The floorboard hideaway was not one design, but dozens. In the Foxfire books compiled by high school students in Rabun County, Georgia, beginning in 1966, elderly mountain men described in detail what their fathers and grandfathers had stored beneath their cabin floors. A short list drawn from those interviews and from the oral histories at Berea College and Alice Lloyd College gives you the shape of the thing. A copper worm, the coiled tube that condensed steam back into liquid, kept oiled and wrapped in burlap so it would not corrode. Spare thump kegs, smaller than the main still, easier to hide and easier to replace. A leather-bound ledger of customers written in a code only the family could read, where a name like Walter might mean a doctor in Asheville and a name like Sarah might mean a sheriff who looked the other way. Rolls of currency, sometimes thousands of dollars in small bills, because no mountain moonshiner trusted a bank after 1929. Federal court summonses kept not as keepsakes but as evidence of which neighbors had been called to testify and against whom a second, still smaller, ready to be assembled within hours if the main operation was destroyed. Sacks of malted corn sealed in oilcloth against the damp. A list of trail markers, often a single page showing which routes through the mountains were safe and which had been compromised. Spare percussion caps and powder because the rifle above the mantle was for show and the real weapons were below. Family Bibles with bootlegging routes pressed between the pages of Leviticus because no agent in 1925 would think to look there. A child's school primer sometimes with the deeds to the family land sewn into its binding. Small jars of cherry bounce, the cherry-soaked liquor that Amos Owens of Rutherford County, North Carolina, had made famous before his death in 1906, kept as samples to show buyers, brass molds for counterfeit federal tax stamps, photographs, hidden, because to be photographed at the wrong moment was evidence. Spare shoe leather, because a man on the run wore through boots faster than he could afford to replace them. A folded American flag in some cabins, because many of these men had sons in the Great War, and the flag meant something even when the federal government meant something else. A letter from a grown daughter who had gone to work in a Knoxville textile mill, hidden. Reading it openly meant admitting the family could not feed everyone at home. A small notebook of medicinal recipes that used corn liquor as the base. Recipes that the family doctor still endorsed in private, even when the law forbade them in public. And in nearly every cabin documented in the Foxfire interviews, a single item that stands out from the rest. A list of names, the names of every neighbor who had ever been suspected of informing. This is where the federal government became something more than an inconvenience. By 1935, the United States Treasury had pivoted from broad prohibition enforcement to targeted prosecution, and in the Western District of Virginia. The Great Moonshine Conspiracy trial of that year exposed the scale of what the mountain people had built. 20 defendants were named. The transcript runs to thousands of pages. Federal prosecutors documented an organized network that had moved an estimated $33 million worth of untaxed liquor through Franklin County alone in the years between 1930 and 1935. Willie Carter Sharp, the Virginia driver who had run loads through the Blue Ridge in a Hudson with the back seat removed, testified for the prosecution. She had been caught. She had been offered a deal. She took it. The community seemed about to break. But here is where the lesson reaches across a 100 years to anybody watching this who feels crushed by a system designed to keep them dependent. The mountain families did not survive because they were stronger than the federal government. They were not. They survived because they understood three principles. Those three principles still apply to anyone trying to hold on to something the larger system would prefer they did not have. The first principle was redundancy. No mountain family kept everything in one place. The floorboard held some of it. A hollow tree 2 miles into the woods held the rest. A cousin 3 ridges over held the third copy. If you have one bank account, one income, one skill, one supplier, one home for the things that matter to you, you are exactly as fragile as the mountain man who kept his entire still in one shed. The man who kept 3 sheds in 3 places, known to 3 different people, was the man who survived 1,935. The second principle was documentation and code. The mountain families did not refuse to keep records. They kept records that were useless to anyone who did not already know the family. A modern equivalent is not paranoia. It is simply the recognition that information has value, that information can be turned against you, and that the form in which you store information matters as much as whether you store it, write things down. Write them down in a way that requires context to read. The third principle was the long memory. The list of suspected informants under the floorboard was not for revenge. It was for the next generation. It said, this is who failed us, and this is who held the line. A community that forgets which neighbors stood with it and which neighbors sold it out is a community that will be sold out again. Memory is infrastructure. Maggie Bailey, the woman they called the Queen of the Mountain bootleggers in Harlan County, Kentucky, understood all 3 principles for 60 years. She never married. She never lost her composure in a courtroom. She fed half the county during the Depression with the profits of liquor she sold at fair prices to people the larger economy had abandoned. She died in 2005 at the age of 101, having outlived nearly every federal agent who had ever tried to break her. The Appalachian Oral History Project at Alice Lloyd College recorded her interviews. They are still there. Anyone can listen. And the climax of all of this The documented reveal that resolves the question of how a scattered population held off the most aggressive enforcement campaign in rural American history is contained in a single observation buried on page 187 of Joseph Dabney's Mountain Spirits. The federal government had assumed going into Prohibition that the Moonshiners were criminals. They prepared accordingly. They sent agents. They built cases. They prosecuted individuals. What they discovered slowly and at enormous cost was that they were not facing criminals. They were facing a culture. They were not facing men who had decided to break the law. They were facing families who had been doing the same thing for 4 generations and who regarded the law as the recent arrival, not themselves. You cannot prosecute a culture out of existence. You can only wait for it to forget itself. And the floorboards were the reason it never did. Every object hidden beneath them was a refusal to forget. Popcorn Sutton, who took his own life in 2009 rather than report to federal prison at the age of 62, said in his self-published memoir that the men who taught him had taught their fathers, that the day he stopped teaching the next generation was the day the mountain finally lost. He was wrong about that. The archives held what he could no longer hold. The recordings at Berea, the transcripts at East Tennessee State, the Foxfire volume still on library shelves, the court records in the federal building in Roanoke, the knowledge survived because somebody at every step refused to let it die quietly. What you just witnessed was not a story about liquor. It was a story about a people who decided that the things that mattered to them would not be surrendered, even when surrender was the easier choice. If you believe real American history has been softened, sanitized, and buried, you understand why this channel exists. Of the figures named in this story, Maggie Bailey, Popcorn Sutton, Willie Carter Sharp, Amos Owens, which one would you have wanted to sit across a table from, and why? Leave your answer in the comments and tell us what state or country you are watching from tonight. Subscribe to stand with a growing community of people who refuse to let real history disappear. The next account will examine the 1,958 raid on the Dawson County Stills in northern Georgia, and the one 4-year-old boy who walked 19 miles through a snowstorm to warn his uncle. His name was on a list. The list survived. So did he